Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into the case of a really well-loved TV sportscaster who, kind of out of nowhere, was taken off the air. Now, at the station, they said it was all about the ratings. But a jury? They saw a totally different story, one about market research, office politics, and, yeah, age.
Okay, so let's dive right in. The main question here is pretty simple, but it's also incredibly tough to prove in a court of law. Was this successful veteran sportscaster really taken off the air because of a straightforward business decision? Or was there something else going on? Something illegal?
All right, every story needs a main character. And for us, that person is C. Thomas Ryther. For years and years, he was the face of sports for KARE 11 News in the Twin Cities, a household name.
So Ryther was no rookie, right? He'd been the station's go-to sports anchor for more than a decade, a really familiar face for viewers. But then, in 1991, when he was 53 years old, that long, successful run came to a very sudden stop.
And, his replacement wasn't some hotshot they brought in from the outside. Nope. KARE 11 promoted Jeff Passolt, a guy from the very same sports department who just happened to be 20 years younger than Ryther. And that little fact, it would become a huge cornerstone of the legal case. So you're probably wondering, how did the station explain this decision? Well, publicly, KARE 11 rolled out a story that on the surface sounded perfectly logical. And more importantly, they said it was backed up by hard data. The station's defense was crystal clear. Look, this wasn't personal, it was just business. They claimed their decision was completely objective, all based on some professional market research they'd done on their on-air talent. And they didn't just say research. They pointed to a specific survey from the very well-respected Gallup organization. According to the station, this research showed that Ryther was, and I quote, an underperformer, and that he just wasn't connecting with the audience like his main competitor was. I mean, with a Gallup poll as your evidence, it really does seem like an open and shut case, doesn't it? But as Ryther's legal team started to dig a little deeper, some pretty serious cracks began to show up in that official story.
So now, let's put on our detective hats and look at the evidence the jury saw. We're going to look at the little pieces of the puzzle that started to make the station's official story unravel, beginning with a really big contradiction.
The very first crack in their story was all about the timing. Get this, just a few months before the station said that market research proved he was a failure, Ryther's own supervisor gave him a commendable rating. That's the second highest mark you can get. And it wasn't just his supervisor saying he was doing great. A talent coach, who was hired by the station itself, was praising Ryther's work in August of 1990, which was the exact same time the station claimed its research showed he was underperforming. It just doesn't add up, right? Then there was the Gallup Survey itself. Ryther's team argued it was basically designed for him to fail. See, he was left out of these really important open-ended questions, the ones that let viewers talk about what they liked about a personality. But you know who was included? His younger colleagues and his main competitor. The station's excuse? Oh, including him would just make the survey too long. So, beyond the sketchy data, the evidence then shifted to the actual culture inside the sports department. Testimony started to come out that younger colleagues, including the very guy who would replace him, made some pretty nasty comments about Ryther's age. And these weren't just one-off incidents. A former intern testified that remarks like old man, old fart, and that Ryther was too old to be on the air, well, they were made 10 or more times by people in his own department. And here's where it gets bigger. Ryther's lawyers argued this wasn't just about one guy. They brought evidence of a broader pattern at the station, where several older employees who had years of good reviews would suddenly start getting poor ones and find themselves pushed toward early retirement or demotion. So now you've got two completely different stories. But how does all of this actually play out in a court of law? Let's take a second and break down how you actually build an age discrimination case. So to even get a case like this in front of a jury, you have to establish what's called a prima facie case. It's basically a fancy way of saying you have to check these 4 boxes. Was he over 40? Yep. 53. Was his performance good enough? Well, his reviews and 12 years of service sure seemed to say so. Was he let go? Yes. Was he replaced by someone younger? Yep. So Ryther easily cleared that first hurdle. Okay, after that, the ball is in the employer's court. They give their legitimate, non-discriminatory reason, in this case, bad market research. Then, the job of the person suing is to prove that this reason was just a pretext, just a cover story for the real discriminatory motive. So the jury, they heard all of it. They heard the station's data-driven defense, and they heard Ryther's evidence of all the contradictions, the biased research, and the hostile work environment. And then they had to make a decision. And in the end, the jury's verdict was pretty decisive. They sided with Ryther. They concluded that the whole market research story wasn't the real reason his contract wasn't renewed. They believed it was a pretext, a cover-up for the real motive, his age. The court awarded Ryther over $1.25 million in back pay, damages, and legal fees. The station did appeal, but that judgment was ultimately upheld.
So why is this case so important today? Well, the big takeaway is that you don't always need a smoking gun. A person can actually win a case like this by creating a sort of mosaic of circumstantial evidence. Conflicting reviews, biased processes, stray remarks that all point the jury to one simple conclusion. The company's official story just doesn't add up.
And that really leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? This case gives us a legal roadmap for proving discrimination even without direct evidence. But it also shines a big spotlight on the huge challenge at the heart of all these cases. How do you pierce that corporate veil and prove what someone was really thinking when they made a decision that changed someone's entire career?